Hello, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of how to use the new weaving tools in Ornatrix to create a basic rattan basket, which is parametric and easily editable. If you go to the Ephere Ornatrix menu here, at the bottom there will be two new buttons. One is called Weaver and the other one is called Weave Pattern. First I will create the reference geometry, which will be my actual basket. I will keep it very simple. It needs to be a box with exactly one segment on each side, and this will be my basket shape. So basket shape is great except for the fact that it has a top, which we don't need. I'm going to remove this top. Again, sorry for the fact that I have a black background. This is some driver issue which I cannot get rid of, but your background should be gray. So I'm going to go and select my box and go into the modifier list, and in here I'm going to use the editable, or rather edit poly modifier. You can also convert this box to an editable poly, but that would kind of destroy the proceduralism here, because then I wouldn't be able to go back to my box object to adjust the length and the width of the box. So I'm going to use the editable poly, or rather edit poly modifier. I'm going to select the face mode and just get rid of this top face over here. So we are left with the four side faces and we just have one bottom face of this box. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the texture coordinates of this box are properly created and that each face of this box is uniquely identifiable in the texture space. To do this, I'm going to need to unwrap this box, and I'm going to use the UVW unwrap modifier. Once I add this modifier and I open the UV editor, you can see right away where our problem is, and the problem is that each one of the faces are overlapping each other. So if I select any of these faces, they are all filling the UV space from 0 to 1. For us, this is a problem because we will need to be placing patterns uniquely on the faces, and we have to have these faces to be spread all over our UV space over here. This is quite easily done, and it is a somewhat of a manual task, but there are probably tools out there that you can use to simplify this process by packing these faces while preserving their relative size. I'm just going to do this quickly here by hand. So I'm going to select the bottom face and I'm going to drag it out of this space for now. And then I'm going to go over each of the top faces and I'm going to spread them horizontally so they are touching each other. So I'm going to select this face. I'm going to move it here. It is important to note that the faces need to be aligning with each other in a way that they touch at the same edge where the world geometry is touching these edges. So for example, if I have this face, then I select this face, you can see that the UV editor is telling me that this face over here, or rather this edge over here, which is marked as blue, is the edge that will be touching these faces together. So I need to be touching them in the UV editor as well. So the next edge is over here on the side, and if I select it, again it's telling me that this edge over here is blue one, which is touching, so I need to preserve this information. And the last edge is this one over here, and I'm just going to drag it out and place it over here so it's touching this edge or this face over here. It doesn't need to be completely perfect, but this needs to be aligning together pretty closely. And when I'm happy I can see that they're all spread out evenly, I can just select all of these faces over here and scale them down so they fit inside of my UV space. So scale them and move inside the UV space, and it's probably good to have them a little bit bigger so they fit a little bit nicer inside. So once I have done this is pretty much all that I will need to do with my reference geometry over here, and we can move on to creating the actual weaver and the patterns for it. So I'm going to go down to the Ephere Ornatrix menu here and create a weaver. And for the target geometry, I'm just going to select the box over here that we created. Once I do this, the weaver icon changes to this target geometry, but we cannot see it very well, so I need to scale it up. As I keep scaling, you can see that we pretty much have our unwrapped UV faces appear, and they appear the same way that they appear in the UV editor. And this is the space that we will be working with. So maybe I can have the scale something like 10,000 to have a better view of it. And next thing I'm going to do is create a basic pattern that we can see on top of our geometry. So I'm going to go back to the Ephere Ornatrix menu here and create a weave pattern object. I'm actually going to be creating two patterns for now. One pattern is going to fill the sides of my basket, and the other pattern is going to fill the bottom of my basket. So I'm just going to create the two patterns. It's probably good to name them, so I'm going to rename this one the bottom pattern, and I'm gonna rename this to side pattern. Next, I will define the curves that are part of my pattern, and for the side one I want to have two curves going horizontally. One of them is going to go in one direction, the other one is going to go the opposite direction, and then I'm gonna have four curves, just straight ones, going vertically. So it's probably easier if I can just create the curves and you can see the idea of what I'm after. So I'm gonna create some points in the middle of it, and this is going to be a spline, so the points will move or interpolate smoothly. And the edges of my spline need to be touching the boundaries of this pattern. We'll see why in a second. It doesn't have to be again perfect, but it has to be close to the boundaries in a way that they will be able to repeat each other once the same pattern is repeated horizontally and vertically. So I'm going to go back into my spline and I'm just going to pull this point up, and I'm going to pull this point a bit down. So we get this kind of S-shaped thing over here. Doesn't need to be as extreme. And next I'm going to instance this pattern, and the reason I'm instancing is and not copying it is to be able to procedurally adjust this one pattern over here and to have the rest of the patterns be adjusted at the same time. I'm just going to rotate this one by 180 degrees. Doesn't need to be perfect, but close enough. And again, I'm going to make sure that it's touching the edges over here. So we have our two horizontal patterns. Now I'm going to create the vertical lines. Again, using the line tool, I'm going to hold down the shift key to make sure it's perfectly vertical. And I'm going to instance it to create two lines over here. And then I'm going to again instance these two lines to create two lines going in this direction. Once I'm relatively happy with what I have, it doesn't need to be perfect, we can adjust it in the future if we need to, but you get the general idea of what I'm going after. I can go and select my side pattern over here, and I can add all of these curves using the add multiple button. Once I add them, you can see that all of the boundary points are being marked, and these are the points that will be touching each other, or rather that are being connected between each other when the pattern is repeated. So now I can go back into my Weaver object, and for now I can add this single pattern into the object, and you can see that each one of these faces now holds this pattern. One thing right away that I notice is that the pattern is not oriented correctly, because the two lines that are supposed to be going vertically are actually going horizontally here. So what I can do is go into my Weaver object over here, and at the face settings panel here, I can change the pattern rotation from 0 to 1, and this will rotate the pattern on all of the faces. And now this is more closely resembling what I want, because the vertical patterns are now actually going vertically on the basket, and these two lines are going horizontally. At the moment we are very straightforward spreading these patterns on the target geometry, but we don't really have a lot of control over what's going on. To add more control, we will create separate geometry which will define how the patterns are being spread on our geometry, and it will significantly simplify the process of editing and making sure that these patterns are following our design much closer. So to do this, I'm going to go and create a plane object, and this plane is going to spread over all of these four faces over here. And I'm going to make sure that this plane is a single face. This will make things really simple for us. So I'm going to spread this plane over my faces and change the length and width a little bit so it matches the sides of our pattern here. Next, I'm going to change the width and length segments to 1. So again, we just have a single large face here. Once I'm done doing that, I can go back into my Weaver object and add this plane object as reference geometry here. It says optional, but it's pretty important to have this if you want to have a lot of control over the way that the patterns are distributed on the target geometry. Again, right now you can see that the pattern is incorrectly oriented, and we can go back and change the rotation back to 0. So right now this one pattern is being spread all over this geometry here. And the reason that we get this one pattern appearing instead of multiple like we have before is because we have one giant face as our reference geometry, whereas before we had one face for every side of our box. But what we can do now is easily control the way that this pattern appears on our box by changing the count of the patterns along each edge of our box. So if you go to Weaver here and expand this drop-down menu, you have two sub-object modes. First sub-object mode is called Faces, where you can select the faces of our reference geometry, and for each face you can control which patterns appear on this face. For now it really doesn't matter because we only have one pattern, but this will come in handy in a few minutes. The other part is called Edges. If you go to the Edges sub-object mode, you can control how many patterns are generated along the edges of our reference geometry. So for example, along this edge we can specify a constant value, and we can change the count to whatever we want. Right now we have 1, but we can have 2 patterns, 3 patterns, 4 patterns, and so on. This is specifying the edges constantly, and just like we are specifying it along this edge, we can also select this edge here and do the same thing. Specify constant and change the number of patterns which are appearing vertically. This is great because we can control the patterns both horizontally and vertically, and this adds a lot of control to our final shape. Notice that to change the number of patterns that appear horizontally, I only select this edge and set the number of patterns. I don't select the opposite edge. And the reason why this works is because the opposite edges automatically adopt the settings of whatever edge you specify. So you don't really need to go and select all of the edges and set the patterns to them. Just select one edge, and all of the edges that you didn't specify this setting for will automatically inherit or deduce what you are trying to do. I can actually go and try to change the number of patterns on the other edge. If you see, if I select by default, it has the inherit option, which means that it will inherit the global settings. If you go out of the sub-object mode and go down to the edge settings here, these are the global settings. By default they're inherit as well, which means it's just going to have one pattern. But you can change this global setting to whatever you want, and all of the edges will inherit it. If I go back to my edges mode and select the bottom edge here and change it to a constant value, I can again edit the number of patterns that appear at the bottom. And the reason why we're getting this kind of wonky pattern spreading all over the face is because we have a mismatch. So at the top we have 10 patterns generated, at the bottom we have 9 patterns generated, and it's trying to do its best job to line up these patterns with each other. But of course, if you have fewer patterns at the top than at the bottom, you're not going to be able to line them up perfectly, and you're going to have distortions going on like this. So in general, it's good to just leave it as inherit and specify the patterns only along the edges where you mean to have control over them. So up to now we have been specifying the constant value for the number of patterns at each edge, but we can also do another thing, and we can specify the number of patterns being controlled by the length of the edge. So if I set the length property here, and it's set to 10 right now, you can see that there are a lot more patterns appearing. And the way it's calculating the number of patterns to be appearing in this edge right now is it's actually calculating the length of our target geometry's edges, all of these 4 edges over here, and it divides this length by this value over here to calculate the number of patterns that you want. So essentially you're saying how big you want each pattern to be in size, in this case 10, but if I change this number to a smaller value, we'll get more patterns. If I change this to a bigger value, we'll get fewer patterns. The cool part about this is if I set this to length, it now is dependent on the size of our target geometry. So if I go back into my box object, and if I go back to the base box settings and turn on the show end result, when I resize this box, you can see that the number of patterns changes. And this is cool because it allows us to parametrically change the size of our objects even long after we have defined and modeled their final weave. And it is going to modify the weave to ensure that we have the right size of the pattern going along it. So I'll go back into my weave object and go back into the edges mode. And for the side object over here, I'll also use the length value. And I can use the same length here, so 10 for the width and 10 for the height. This way we'll get the uniform distribution of the patterns both horizontally and vertically, so the proportion of our pattern size is preserved. So now that we have done the side of this object, let's do the bottom one as well. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go and create another plane object, and this time I'm gonna align it with the bottom of our basket. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be pretty well aligned. And the reason for that is because we're going to be connecting the patterns that are at the bottom and at the top and at the side of the box. I'm going to use my eye to adjust this as good as I can. So once I created this box over here, I'm going to select my first plane. I'm going to go into editable poly again, and I'm going to attach this other plane over here. And the reason that I need to attach it is because the reference geometry needs to be one single mesh so that we can go and edit the faces of this mesh inside of our weaver object. So I'm going to use this attach button. I'm going to attach this other plane. Once I do this, it is referring back to our global edge settings and generating just one pattern along the bottom of our box. So if you take a close look here, for the bottom we cannot have the same pattern as we have for the sides, because vertically we have 4 lines going for each pattern, and it's not going to align properly because we only have 2 horizontal lines here, but we have 4 vertical lines here. What we need to happen is to have another pattern which has 4 lines going both horizontally and vertically, such that they're able to connect these patterns from each side of our box in a way which will not leave us with any lines that are not connected between each other. So to do this, I'm going to go and define the lines along my bottom pattern over here. I'm a bit lazy today, so I'm just going to copy these curves that I created for the first pattern. Again, I'm going to instance them so that we can only modify the first curve, and the second one will automatically be modified as well. And I'm going to create a copy of them like this. And then I'm going to instance the other 4 curves as well. So again, we have created the curves in a way that they're not intersecting with each other, which will be important because on our final mesh, these patterns are generated in a way that will fill the sides, but it is up to us to make sure that the lines are not intersecting each other to create a realistic kind of weaving look for our basket. So this pattern is different from this one because now we have 4 lines going in each direction, but this pattern is more uniform because it can be tiled both vertically and horizontally, and it can also be rotated and tiled, so it has symmetry along both its width and its height. I'm going to go into this pattern and manually add all of the 4 curves to it. And then I'm going to go back into my weaver object over here, and in this source curves list I'm going to add my second pattern. Once I do this, you can see that we kind of get all kinds of weird results over here. The reason for that is by default is going to pick patterns at random and spread them over our faces. We don't really want that because we want just this one side pattern to appear on the side faces. And also we want this bottom pattern to just appear on the bottom face. To specify this, we go into the faces sub-object mode of our viewer, and here again we select this face which represents the sides of our basket, and we're just going to use this side pattern here and add it to our list. Once you do that, only the side pattern appears here. This bottom list here specifies which patterns you want on each face to appear. If it's blank, it's going to randomly select from the patterns in the overall global list. But if it's not blank, it's going to just select, it's just going to use whatever you specified here. So the same thing I can do for the bottom face. I select this bottom, which represents this bottom of our basket, and I'm going to use the bottom pattern for it. So we're back to what we had before, and the question now is how do we make this bottom face generate the patterns which will perfectly align with the side of our basket. Well, we can manually adjust the length and the number of patterns for our edges here, but there is an automated way to do this in our Weaver object. If we scroll down the list here, you can see that there is an option called Connect Close Boundaries. If I turn this on, nothing will happen right now because we need to adjust the settings first. And to adjust the settings, we need to know what they're doing. The purpose of this option here is that by default, these two faces are disconnected from each other in the reference space, so the Weaver doesn't really know how these patterns over here are meant to be connected to this pattern over here. However, this option uses the overall target geometry to look up which faces are touching each other. So this bottom edge over here is clearly touching the edge faces, and it will try to use this geometric data to match these patterns up. The edge samples over here is the number of samples it is taking along the edges to calculate this information. The more samples it has, the more precise the calculation will be. I'm going to change this value from 10 to 30 for now, and right away we can see that there is some difference. And the distance threshold is the distance between the patterns that will be allowed to be there for them to be connected between each other. As you can see, the patterns on the side of the face are not exactly at the bottom here, so we need to adjust this value to be a little bit higher, so it will take this extra gap here for consideration. I'm going to increase distance. As I keep increasing it, you can see some more stuff happening, and at some point, I guess it's a value of 2 or above, it starts matching these values up. So this is looking much better. It is actually trying to create as many patterns on the bottom as are needed to connect all of these edges together. And also, if you notice now, if I turn this option off, that the patterns on this edge over here are not being connected to the patterns of this edge over here, and this results in a visible gap over here. If I turn this option on, this gap is connected and the patterns are now closed. Okay, so now that we have this, what if I wanted to go and add another pattern to do something at the top of our basket, for example, to create loops over here? This is very easily done. Again, I go back and I need to define a separate pattern that will be at the top of our basket. I'm going to go back to the Ephere Ornatrix menu and use the weave pattern object over here. And now we have to think what kind of pattern we want at the top. Clearly we have for each horizontal pattern we have 4 vertical lines going upwards, and we need to think about how these lines will be terminated at the top. So I'm going to go and create a new line object, or rather in this case I'm going to create a shape object in form of a helix. I'm going to zoom in on my pattern here. So I'm going to create a helix like this, set its height, and I'm going to drag it so it appears at the top of my pattern. I'm going to change its inner radius so that this point is not touching the boundary, but this point is touching the boundary, and I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees. So the bottom of the helix is aligning with the bottom of our pattern. Next, I'm going to duplicate this helix 4 times so that we have 4 points at the bottom of the pattern, which will be aligning perfectly with the 4 points at the top of our other pattern. And now I can adjust the height of my helix so that it is fitting inside the space of our pattern. And inside of this pattern object, I'm going to add all of the 4 helix objects which we just created. We see that there is a point which is touching the boundary. We want to get rid of it, so I'm going to go back to my helix and change the height a little bit until it disappears, just like this. So now we need to think about how to place this new pattern into our target geometry so that it only appears along the top edge over here. It is pretty difficult to do this once you look at the target geometry, but it is becoming much simpler once you look at the reference geometry. So this is our bottom face over here, this is our edge face over here, the bottom face patterns are being connected to the edge face. So if I rotate it like this, it is actually more intuitive. So this is the bottom, this is the edge, and this must be the top of our basket. If I go back to my plane, which is defining the reference geometry, let me just hide the weaver object for now. So this is my plane, this is the side of the pattern, this is the bottom. I can go back into the edit poly operator. I can go into the edit poly modifier, select the edge mode, select these two edges, and then I'm going to connect them. And this new edge, I'll just drag up to create this kind of face at the top of our basket, which will contain this last pattern over here. So once I do this, I'm just going to unhide my weaver object again. The patterns are all screwed up because we have changed the number of faces, but we can easily fix this by going to the weaver object, selecting the faces mode, selecting this new face over here. First, actually, we need to add this last pattern that we created into our overall weaver, so I'm going to go and add this pattern here. Again, it's randomly distributing our patterns, so we need to fix this first. I'm going to go to the faces, select the top face first. We're just going to use the last pattern for the top. Select this face over here. We just use the side pattern for this one. Select the bottom. We just use the bottom pattern, which is already assigned. And then we'll need to go back to the edges and adjust the settings again. So this edge will use length of 10. The bottom edge, or rather this edge here, will also use the length of 10. And this edge over here, which is defining our top pattern, will just use a constant value of 1. So once we've done this, you can see how this looks in our final basket. So we have added this pattern at the top, and it is terminating these points in kind of a loop-to-loop like here. Again, we can always go back to our helix curves and adjust the values until it looks much better. So I can adjust the radius here, and you can see that it is being reflected in our final weaved basket. I can adjust the height, or I can even go and do something like change the proportions of individual helix shapes over here. So I'm going to select them 4, and I'm going to scale them down a bit, and we'll have our helixes. Because I don't really want to have a completely square box, I can select my target geometry, and now I can do whatever geometric operations I want to do with them. I can create new faces, extrude them, or in this case I can add a turbo smooth operator and change the number of iterations. And to better see my result, I can just hide this box. You can notice there are some artifacts over here, and these patterns are not being lined up perfectly, so some of them might be kind of going into a point like this. The reason for that is most likely due to the fact that I did not line up these faces as perfectly with the source geometry as I should have. So there you can see that there are still gaps over here, and I need to fix that by going back into my reference geometry plane and using some tools to adjust my face so that it is much better at overlapping our geometry. If the face is too big, it's going to not generate any patterns, so you gotta be careful that the face still feels inside of the inside of our target geometry. And I'm doing this all by hand, but a much better strategy will probably be to use some kind of type-in system where you are able to have more precise values that you can type in. As I adjust my edge, the patterns are already behaving much better. And the same thing goes here. If you select this edge, you can see that it's nowhere near being perfectly lined up with our source geometry. So I need to fix this by going and making sure that it is closer matching. So if you align these values perfectly, you can see that they will be perfectly matching up with each other, and you'll get the exact counts of the guides happening on each side of this basket, creating some visually pleasing weave results like this. And if I go back to my box and if I resize it, and I just turn on the show end result, the weave is properly getting affected by the edges of the box as well as the sides of it. If I go back to my guide skin object, I can add some Ornatrix modifiers on top of it, such as render settings and mesh from strands, to create the mesh geometry for my basket. And I can use some other operators such as freeze and length and anything else that you would use in Ornatrix to parametrically edit your guides. This is a quick overview of the weaving tools in Ornatrix to create a rattan basket, but more complicated topics will follow in the future. So I hope this gives you enough of a kind of intuitive feel of how this weave object works with target and reference geometry and specifying patterns to give you a head start. Thanks for watching.